Three men, one parking garage. 3 in the morning. They thought they had her cornered, a tired ER nurse with dried blood on her scrubs and nowhere to run. She'd just reported one of their own to the police. Now they wanted her to understand what that cost. The biggest one blocked the exit. The second circled left. The third pulled out a blade and grinned like this was already over. Harper Brooks looked at all 3 of them. Then she did something none of them expected. She reached up, tied her hair back, and smiled. "Wrong woman," she said quietly. None of them knew what that meant yet. They were about to find out. If this story already has you gripping your seat, subscribe to this channel so you never miss what comes next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning, because to understand that parking garage, you need to understand Harper Brooks. And Harper Brooks is not who she appears to be. The night shift at Redwood Memorial Hospital in Ashcroft City had a particular kind of gravity to it. Not the clean, cinematic kind you see in medical dramas. The real kind, where the fluorescent lights buzzed too loud, the coffee tasted like warm regret, and the patients kept coming regardless of whether the staff had slept in 36 hours. Harper Brooks had been on her feet since 7 the previous morning. It was now past midnight. She had a half-eaten protein bar in her jacket pocket and a dull ache behind her right eye that she'd stopped noticing around hour 9. She moved through the trauma bay with the kind of quiet efficiency that came not from grace, but from repetition. The same motions, night after night, year after year, until her hands knew what to do before her brain caught up. She was 34 years old, 5'6", brown hair usually pulled back. A face that most people forgot within 10 minutes of meeting her, which she'd always considered one of her more useful qualities. The other nurses called her steady. The attending physicians called her competent. Dr. Mara Solano, who ran the night trauma team, called her indispensable, though usually only in private, because complimenting nurses too often apparently made some of the surgical residents uncomfortable. Harper had stopped caring about any of that a long time ago. She was there for the patients. Everything else was just noise. The patient in Bay 4 was not a sympathetic case. He'd come in at 11:47 p.m. with a stab wound to the lateral abdomen, deep enough to require irrigation and likely internal exploration, not so deep that he was bleeding out on her table. His name, according to the ID in his wallet, was Marcus Dell, 26 years old. Multiple prior arrests. Currently, according to the tattoos visible on his neck and left forearm, affiliated with a crew known in Ashcroft City's South Corridor as the Burnside Outfit, a name that showed up regularly in the local news whenever something got set on fire or someone turned up in a dumpster. None of that was Harper's business while he was on her table. That was the job. You treated the patient in front of you. You didn't ask how they got there. She irrigated the wound with careful, methodical strokes. Dell hissed through his teeth. "You're going to feel pressure," she said. "I'm fine," he muttered. "You're not fine. You have a 3-centimeter laceration and possible involvement of the external oblique. But you will be fine if you hold still." He held still. What happened next was not something Harper planned. It was simply what happened when you rolled a patient to check for exit wounds and a 9mm handgun fell out of his waistband and clattered onto the floor of a hospital trauma bay at 12 past midnight. Both of them stared at it. "That's not mine," Dell said immediately. Harper looked at the gun, then at him. Then she picked up the phone and called hospital security. It wasn't a difficult decision. She didn't agonize over it, didn't run internal calculations about whether it was worth the trouble. A loaded firearm in a trauma bay was a safety issue. She reported it. Security came. Police were called as a matter of protocol. Dell was placed under watch while his wound was finished being treated. Harper documented everything and moved on to Bay 7. She didn't think about it again until she walked out to the parking structure at 2:48 a.m., gym bag on her shoulder, car keys in her hand, and found 3 men waiting for her in the amber half-dark between level 2 and the stairwell. The one in the center she didn't recognize. The 2 flanking him she did. They'd been in the waiting room earlier, watching the desk with the kind of aggressive patience that people used when they wanted you to know they were watching. "You the one who called the cops on our boy?" the one in the center said. He wasn't tall, but he was wide, and he stood with the easy confidence of someone who'd had this kind of conversation before and knew how it ended. Harper stopped walking, assessed the distance, 12 feet, then 10 as he stepped forward. "I did my job," she said. "Wrong answer." The one on the left moved first. Not to attack, just to cut off the exit route to the elevator. The one on the right hadn't moved yet, but his hand was near his jacket pocket in a way that had a specific meaning. Harper set her gym bag down carefully on the concrete floor. In a different life, in the life most people assumed she'd always lived, this would have been the moment to scream, to run, to bargain. She understood why they expected that. She looked the part. Scrubs, hospital badge, a woman alone at 3 a.m. in a parking garage. The picture assembled itself in ways that told a certain story. The story was wrong. She reached up, pulled the elastic from her wrist, and tied her hair back. "You still have time to walk away," she said. The man in the center laughed. Not a cruel laugh, genuinely amused. He turned to the one on his right and said something low, and that man smiled too. "She's serious," the flanker said, still smiling. "Yeah," Harper said. "I am." What happened in the next 40 seconds was not glamorous. It was not choreographed. It was fast, and it was ugly, and it ended with 2 of the 3 men on the concrete and the third, the one who'd been guarding the exit, pressed face first against a support pillar with his arm at an angle that made further movement seem like a genuinely bad idea. Harper held the position for 3 full seconds, listening. Then she stepped back and let him go. He didn't move immediately, just breathed. "I'm going to call 911, Harper said. "You can be here when they arrive, or you can leave. Your friends are going to need medical attention within the next hour. The one on the left has a possible shoulder dislocation, and the one in the center is going to have a concussion. Tell them to go to the ER." A brief pause. "Not Redwood Memorial." She picked up her gym bag, walked to her car, sat inside, and waited until she heard footsteps moving away before she let herself exhale. Then she called 911, gave her name, her badge number, and a factual account of what had happened, and waited for the police to arrive. It took 12 minutes. By then, only one of the 3 men was still on level 2. The next morning began at 6:45 with a phone call from hospital administration. Harper was still in her car. She'd slept in the hospital lot, which she'd done before on long shifts, because the 30-minute drive home felt pointless when she was back on at 7. She answered on the second ring. "This is Diane Pruitt, from the office of the Chief Medical Officer." The voice was crisp and careful. "We need you to come in before your shift, Ms. Brooks." "I'm already here," Harper said. A pause. "Oh. Then, conference room B, please, 8 o'clock. She found out what the meeting was about at 8:02. Dr. Elliot Vance, Chief Medical Officer of Redwood Memorial, a tall man with carefully arranged silver hair, who always wore the same style of blue-striped tie in what Harper assumed was an attempt to project consistency, sat at the head of the table. Beside him was the hospital's legal counsel, a woman Harper had seen exactly once before. Across from them was Lieutenant Gary Ferris from the Ashcroft Police Department, who looked like he'd been awake as long as Harper had. "Last night's incident in the parking structure," Vance began. "I already gave a full statement to the officers on scene," Harper said. "We're aware of that. This is about the hospital's position regarding my position," Lieutenant Ferris said, leaning forward slightly, "is that 3 men were found in your parking garage in the early hours of this morning with injuries consistent with defensive force, and one of them is claiming you initiated physical contact." "He's lying," Harper said. "He may well be, but he's also the associate of a man currently in our custody on weapons charges, which you are directly responsible for initiating." Ferris watched her. "You understand how this looks. I understand what happened. Ms. Brooks." This was Vance again, his voice taking on the slightly softened tone of someone delivering news they'd already decided on. "Given the complexity of the situation, the potential liability to the hospital, the ongoing police matter, the allegations, we think it would be best if you took a temporary leave while this is reviewed." Harper looked at him, then at the lawyer who was studying the table, then back at Vance. "Temporary leave," she said. "Paid, of course." "You're removing me from the floor because a gang member lied to a police officer. We're asking you to step back while the situation is assessed. It's standard protocol." It wasn't. She knew it. He knew it. And based on the way the lawyer had found something very interesting to look at on the table, she knew it too. But Harper had learned a long time ago that there were arguments worth having and arguments that were simply performances, and that telling the difference was one of the more important skills a person could develop. She stood up, smoothed her scrubs, and picked up her badge from the table where she'd set it. "I'll need that back," Vance said, nodding at the badge. Harper placed it on the table. "I want a copy of whatever paperwork you file," she said, "and I want it within 24 hours." She walked out. The drive to her apartment took 31 minutes in morning traffic. She stopped at a gas station for coffee and a sandwich she ate in the parking lot, watching a city bus pull through the intersection twice before she realized she'd been sitting there for almost 20 minutes. She wasn't angry. That was the honest answer, and Harper had always tried to be honest with herself, even when it was inconvenient. She was tired. She was calculating. She was thinking about the man with the shoulder dislocation and whether he'd actually gone to an emergency room, because the joint needed to be reduced within the hour or the tissue damage compounded, and she'd phrased that warning as a choice, but it was really medical advice, and she stopped that line of thinking. It wasn't her problem. She didn't work there anymore, at least temporarily. What she did have was time. Well, Harper's apartment on Decatur Street was a two-bedroom she'd rented for 6 years. The second bedroom had a desk, a filing cabinet, and a wall of shelving. Most of what was on those shelves looked like medical reference texts and paperback novels. A person looking at that room would see what it was designed to show: the modest, organized space of a practical woman. They would not see the titanium reinforcement on the doorframe. They would not notice that the window locks were of a specific type not sold at hardware stores. They would probably not know what they were looking at if they opened the filing cabinet, because most of the documents inside were either in a cipher Harper had developed at 19 or redacted to the point of abstraction. She sat at the desk and opened her laptop. The police report from the previous night was already in the public system. Ashcroft PD updated quickly, which was one of the things she'd noted when she moved to the city. The 3 men had been identified. The one who'd been left on the scene was a mid-level enforcer named Dwayne Wexler, Burnside crew, 3 priors. The other 2 had been taken to St. Anthony's ER, not Redwood Memorial, and were being treated. One of them, per the report, had filed a countercomplaint. Harper read the complaint carefully. It was detailed. More detailed than she'd expected. The story it told was specific. She had approached them first. She had been aggressive. She had provoked the altercation. It described her movements in a way that suggested either a very good memory or, more likely, prior coaching. Someone had prepared that statement before Wexler gave it. She sat back. The weapon she'd reported had been Marcus Dell's. Dell was Burnside. Burnside had 3 men waiting for her in the parking garage within 3 hours of that report. And now one of those men had a coached statement that, if it held up, could result in criminal charges against her and give the hospital legal cover for the termination they probably already had on their minds. This was not improvised. This was a process. Harper had seen processes like this before, not in hospitals. She closed the laptop and looked at the shelf across the room, specifically at the section she never discussed with anyone. There were some people she could call. She hadn't spoken to most of them in years. That was by design. When you left the life she'd left, you left cleanly, because partial exits had a habit of becoming no exit at all. But she had the numbers. She'd kept them the way she kept the window locks and the filing cipher, not because she expected to need them, but because need and expectation were not the same thing. She didn't reach for her phone yet. What she did instead was pull on running shoes, tuck her hair under a cap, and go outside. Ashcroft City in the morning had a different texture than it did at midnight. The South Corridor, where Redwood Memorial sat, was working class and dense. Laundromats and bodegas, and a hardware store that had been there since before Harper was born, according to the faded paint on the brickwork. She ran the same route she always ran, not because she was a creature of habit, but because a consistent pattern was useful for noticing when something changed. Today, something changed. A car, dark blue, 4-door, generic, was parked half a block from her building when she left. It was still there when she came back 40 minutes later, parked in a legal spot, but with 2 men in the front seats who weren't doing anything in particular. Harper ran past without slowing. She went upstairs, showered, and made a mental note. By afternoon, she'd confirmed that the car had moved once, to a spot with a better sightline to the building's entrance. That was professional enough to mean something. She called the one number she'd always kept active, not because she'd expected to, because it was the number she was always supposed to call first. It rang twice. "Brooks," said a voice on the other end, female, measured. The voice of someone who answered phones exactly the same way at noon and at 3 a.m. "Hartley," Harper said. A 3-second pause, longer than the connection required. How bad? Said the voice called Hartley. Harper looked out the window at the dark blue car. I don't know yet, she said, but someone's watching my building. Since when? Since this morning, maybe earlier. You're sure it's not the police? The police would show ID. These two have been sitting in the same car for 6 hours pretending to look at their phones. Another pause, different from the first. The kind of pause that meant things were being processed that Harper couldn't see. I'm going to make a call, Hartley said finally. I'm not asking for... I know you're not asking. I'm telling you I'm going to make a call because that's what I do when one of my people surfaces after 3 years of silence with a surveillance problem. A brief, hard exhale. Give me 4 hours. The line went dead. Harper set her phone on the desk and looked at the wall of shelves. She'd left that world because she wanted to leave it, because she'd gotten tired of operating in the space between what governments knew and what they'd admit to. Tired of the weight of classified casualty lists and missions that never officially happened. She'd come to Ashcroft City and taken a nursing position and built a life that was, by any reasonable measurement, a good one, useful and unglamorous and genuinely hers. She wasn't going back to any of it. She was clear on that. But she was also clear that whatever the Burnside crew had set in motion, they had no idea what they'd actually started. They'd looked at a tired woman in hospital scrubs and seen a target. They'd sent their people. They'd filed their reports. They were operating the way they always operated, with the confidence of those who'd never been wrong before about the nature of the person standing across from them. Harper had let herself out of the frame. She'd walked away from all the things she used to be. But the skills didn't leave. The knowledge didn't leave. And the instinct, the cold, particular clarity that descended when she was genuinely threatened, that had never left either. It was with her now, quiet and alert, while she watched the car in the street below. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unregistered number. Just a time. Tonight. 9 p.m. Parking level 1. Come alone. She looked at the text for a long moment. Then she looked at the dark blue car. Then she put her jacket on. By 8:45, she'd already confirmed that 2 additional men had joined the ones in the car. All 4 moved together when she exited her building, maintaining a distance that was professional but not professional enough. They'd been trained to tail civilian targets, not to follow someone who knew what tailing looked like from both ends. She led them to the parking structure at Redwood Memorial. It was, she'd decided, a reasonable location. She knew the layout. She knew the camera placements. She knew which sections of Level 1 had reliable audio pickup and which had blind spots that ran counter to what the placement suggested. She walked to the spot indicated in the text, stood under a light, and waited. At 9:04, a figure emerged from the stairwell. Not one of the Burnside men. Someone else. Someone she didn't recognize. Medium height. Mid-40s. The kind of posture that came from years of carrying weight in ways that permanently restructured the body. He stopped 10 feet away and looked at her. You're Harper Brooks, he said. Not a question. Who are you? She said. He reached into his jacket slowly, produced a folded document, and held it out. She crossed the distance and took it. Military credentials. Federal investigator designation. A unit designation she recognized immediately. Not because it was famous, but because she'd worked adjacent to it years ago in circumstances she'd never been able to discuss. We've been watching Redwood Memorial for 8 weeks, he said. The Burnside crew has been running an extortion operation against the hospital administration. Money, information, pressure on specific staff members who were getting too close to things the crew needed quiet. He paused. You reporting that weapon last night wasn't in their script. Harper looked at the document again. Then at him. Why are you telling me this? Because you're in the middle of it now, whether you want to be or not. And because... He stopped, looked past her for a fraction of a second, then back. We ran your background this morning when your name came up. The air between them changed in a specific way. I'm a nurse, Harper said. You're a nurse, he agreed. You're also a lot of other things that your employment file doesn't mention. He wasn't threatening. His tone was matter-of-fact in the way of someone stating geography. We're not here to expose anything. We're here because the operation we've been building for 2 months just accelerated, and the person standing in the middle of the parking garage where it's accelerating has a background that suggests she can handle herself. From somewhere above them, level 3, she estimated, based on the acoustics, There was the sound of footsteps, multiple sets, moving with purpose. The investigator turned toward the sound and then back to her. "They followed you here," he said. "I know," Harper said. "I let them." He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but the adjustment a person makes when they realize the picture they had assembled was slightly wrong. "Hartley said you were good," he said. "Hartley talks too much," Harper said. The footsteps on level 3 stopped, then started again, closer. Then the stairwell door above them opened, and the sound of it echoed down through the structure in a way that was not ambiguous. Harper stood very still. She assessed the distance to cover, the angles, the weight of the investigator's stance, whether he was the kind of person who held or the kind who moved. She had about 4 seconds to decide how she wanted this to go. The stairwell door on level 1 opened, and it was not the Burnside men who came through it. It was uniformed personnel, military police insignia. 3 of them, then 4, then the low, unmistakable sound of vehicles outside the structure. Not civilian vehicles, not police cruisers. Something heavier. Something that moved with the specific, deliberate weight of an organization that didn't need to rush because it had already decided how the situation would resolve. The investigator beside her straightened almost imperceptibly. "That's my team," he said. From somewhere in the upper levels came a shout. One of the Burnside men, she thought, the one who'd filed the coached statement. Then scrambling. Then the sounds of an interception that was organized and fast and left no meaningful options for the people on the receiving end. Harper stood in the amber light of level 1 and listened to it unfold. She did not feel relief. She did not feel triumph. What she felt was the particular controlled stillness she'd always felt when something she'd been tracking finally resolved into a definite shape, when the ambiguity collapsed and the situation became, at last, legible. The investigator turned to look at her again. "Major Hartley said you'd walk away from this as soon as it was clear," he said. "Said you'd consider your part done and go home." "She's usually right about things," Harper said. "She is. But there's something you should know first." He held her gaze with the careful attention of someone delivering information they know will matter. "The hospital administrator who put you on leave this morning, Dr. Elliot Vance, we have 18 months of financial records tying him to the Burnside operation. He's not just bowing to pressure from the crew." He paused. "He's been on their payroll since before you started working at Redwood Memorial." Harper looked at him. Outside, through the concrete walls of the parking structure, she could hear the vehicles repositioning, more of them. The operation was expanding. She could feel it in the way the sound pattern shifted, the organized compression of a net tightening. "How long before you move on the hospital?" she said. 48 hours. Maybe less." Above them, the noise on level 3 had gone quiet. Clean. The way things went quiet when trained people had finished what they came to do. Harper looked toward the stairwell door, then back at the investigator. She thought about the trauma bay at Redwood Memorial. She thought about the patients in it right now, being managed by a short-staffed night team while she stood in a parking garage in her civilian clothes and watched federal investigators collect the wreckage of something that had apparently been rotting for a long time inside the institution she'd trusted her work to. She thought about Dr. Mara Solano, who called her indispensable in private. She thought about the man in Bay 4, his tattoos, the gun, the cold mechanical sequence that had followed: call, report, follow, protocol, and how that single act of following protocol had pulled back a corner of something that turned out to be much larger and much older than a single weapon in a single trauma bay on a single night. 48 hours, she repeated. Yes. She picked up her jacket from where she'd set it on the barrier beside her. Then I have 47 hours before I need to be somewhere, she said. The investigator watched her go. He didn't try to stop her. He had, Harper thought, enough professional experience to understand that some people were not to be redirected. She walked out of the parking structure into the Ashcroft City night, and the vehicles that were parked along the outer road didn't move as she passed, just sat there with their engines idling, organized and patient, the machinery of something much larger than a parking garage standoff humming quietly in the dark. Harper kept walking. She didn't know everything yet. She knew enough. The Burnside crew had made the particular error of targeting someone whose real profile they had never thought to look up, and that error had catalyzed something that was going to take the next 48 hours to fully unfold. The corruption inside Redwood Memorial ran higher than she'd guessed. The operation closing in around it was more established than she'd have expected. And Elliot Vance, Careful Vance with his blue striped ties and his liability language and his carefully arranged silver hair, had apparently been working against the hospital and its staff for longer than Harper had been working there. She stopped at the corner and stood for a moment, breathing in the night air of the south corridor, exhaust and someone's late dinner and the particular mineral smell of a city that never fully cooled down. Her phone vibrated. A text from an unknown number. Level 2 camera footage from last night has been preserved and flagged for the record. You're covered. She read it twice. Then she put her phone away and started walking home, and the city moved around her, indifferent and loud and utterly unaware of what was building inside one of its hospitals. A reckoning that had started, as reckonings sometimes did, with a single unremarkable decision to follow the rules. She got home at 10:43, locked the door behind her, and stood in the dark without turning on a single light. Not fear. Habit. The dark gave her brain nothing to chew on except the problem, and the problem needed chewing. She ran a glass of water at the kitchen tap and drank half of it standing up, listening to the building do what it did at night. The radiator ticking down, the neighbor's television bleeding through the ceiling, the third floorboard from the door letting out its small complaint when the hallway pressure changed. That last sound came at 11:12. Harper set the glass down without a sound and moved 4 steps left, out of the sightline from the door, and waited. Nothing followed it. No knock, no second creak. After 90 seconds, she crossed the room, put her eye to the peephole, and saw an empty corridor with the same water stain on the same wall it had worn for 6 years. She still checked the door frame. The thin strip of tape she kept along the lower hinge, a habit so old she barely registered doing it anymore, was intact. But the one on the window in the second bedroom was not. It was a small thing. 2 inches of clear tape, split clean along the seam, the kind of break that came from the sash being lifted and set back down by someone careful enough to close it after. Nothing in the room had been moved. The filing cabinet was locked. The laptop sat where she'd left it, at the same 11-degree angle to the desk edge that she never corrected because the angle itself was information. Harper stood in the doorway for a long moment and let the meaning arrive. They hadn't come to take anything. They'd come to look. She sat down on the floor with her back to the wall. An old posture, one she hadn't used in years, knees up, hands loose, and made herself go through it slowly, the way she'd been taught before she'd ever learned to start an IV. What does an enemy do when he doesn't know what he's holding? He gathers. That was Kessler's voice. Emmett Kessler, who everyone in a certain narrow world had called Kess, who had shown up at a state placement office in a different city 23 years ago, wearing a canvas jacket and a face like weathered stone and signed papers for a 14-year-old girl whose parents had died 6 weeks earlier in a 2-car collision on a rural highway. He'd been her father's friend. That was the whole explanation Harper ever got, and she'd stopped asking for more by 17. He had not raised her gently. He had raised her thoroughly. Anatomy first, because Kess believed you couldn't damage or repair a body you didn't understand. Then movement. Then edged weapons, because he said a person who respected a knife would never be careless with a rifle. He'd made her learn to suture on pigskin in a garage in the middle of winter with her fingers going numb, and when she'd complained about the cold, he'd said, "You think the cold is going to check your schedule?" and gone back to reading. She'd hated him for about 4 years. Then she'd understood him. Then, much later, she'd buried him in a plot with a flat marker and no service, which was how he'd wanted it. Everything that came after, the years she didn't discuss, the missions with no numbers, the operators she'd pulled out of places that officially had no operators in them, all of that had grown out of that garage. Harper stood up, went to the closet, and pulled down a duffel she hadn't touched in 3 years. She didn't open it, she just set it by the door. At 11:58, her phone rang, not a number she knew. "Brooks. Is this Harper?" A woman's voice, tight, fast, half swallowed. "It's Gail. Gail Ortega. I don't know if you remember. I remember. I need..." A breath that went in wrong. "Can you meet me?" "Not at the hospital. Not anywhere near it." Harper looked at the duffel by the door. "Where are you, Yak?" Gail Ortega lived 35 minutes north in a townhouse complex where every unit had the same gray siding and the same square of grass. She answered the door in a bathrobe with her hair unwashed and a kitchen knife in her right hand, which she seemed to have forgotten she was holding until Harper glanced down at it. "Sorry," Gail said. She set it on the hall table. "Sorry." Inside, the blinds were drawn on every window. There were 4 days of dishes in the sink and a suitcase half-packed on the sofa. "You're leaving?" "I'm going to my sister's in Fairlane, tomorrow. Tonight if I can get the car looked at." Gail's hands were doing something restless with the belt of the robe. "I saw the news. About the arrests in the garage. Your name wasn't in it, but I knew the second I read it." "Knew what?" "That they finally came for somebody who didn't fold." Harper didn't sit. "Tell me why you left Redwood." Gail laughed once, and it came out ugly. "Is that the story? That I left?" "That's the story. I was pushed out, Harper. 12 years, and they walked me to the door with a security escort like I'd stolen something." She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. "I filed 6 incident reports in 4 months. 6. Men in the ambulance bay who didn't belong there. Someone in the pharmacy corridor at 2 a.m. with a badge that scanned to a nurse who'd quit in the spring. A guy who followed one of the residents to her car and told her by name, where her kid went to school." "Who did you report to?" "Vance's office. That's the protocol. Everything above a level 2 goes to the CMO." Gail's mouth twisted. "And every single one came back closed. Insufficient corroboration. Same 3 words. 6 times. Harper let that sit. "You kept copies." Gail went still. "Gail." "I kept copies," she said finally. "That's why they escorted me out. That's why my performance file suddenly grew 4 write-ups in a week, for things nobody had ever said a word to me about. They knew I had them, and they wanted me gone before I figured out what to do with them." "Where are they?" "In a fireproof box in my sister's garage in Fairlane, because I'm not an idiot." A pause. "But the photos are on my old—" "It's upstairs." Harper's attention sharpened by a degree. "Photos of what?" "The ambulance bay. 3 separate nights." Gail's voice dropped. "And one of Vance in the north stairwell at 1:40 in the morning, handing an envelope to a man I'd seen in the ER waiting room twice that same week. I didn't know who he was then." "Do you now?" "I saw his face on a news clip tonight," Gail said. "He's the one who got arrested in your garage." Harper was quiet for a second, then, "Get the phone." Gail went upstairs. Harper stood in the front room and did a slow read of the space, the exits, the sight lines, the flimsy interior door on a hollow core frame, the front window with its cheap latch. Which was why she was already moving toward the light switch when headlights swept the blinds. She killed the lamp. "Gail." Not loud. "Enough." Feet on the stairs. "What?" "Come down. Don't run. Left side of the stairs, stay against the wall." Outside, a car door closed. Then a second. Neither of them slammed, which told Harper more than the headlights had. Gail came down white-faced with the phone clutched against her chest. "How did they—" "Your car," Harper said. "Or your sister's address is in a file somewhere. It doesn't matter right now." She took Gail's elbow and steered her toward the kitchen. "Back door. Is there a gate?" "There's a gate. It sticks. Then we go over it. Give me the phone." "No." Gail's grip tightened. "No. This is mine. This is the only thing I have that's mine, out of all of it." Harper looked at her. At the shaking hands, the bathrobe, the 12 years of a career that had been thrown in a dumpster by a man in a striped tie, and made a decision she wasn't sure was tactically correct. "Then hold it, and don't drop it," she said. They went out through the kitchen as the front doorknob turned against the deadbolt. The gate did stick. Harper put a shoulder into it, and it gave with a sound like a snapped bone. And then they were in the alley behind the units, and Gail was running badly in slippers, and Harper had one hand in the back of her robe, steering her the way you steered a patient who'd stopped tracking. Behind them, a voice said something short and flat. Not a shout. A report. 2 units down, Harper pulled Gail sideways into a recessed doorway and pinned her there with a forearm across the chest. Gentle, but immovable. "Don't," she breathed. Footsteps came down the alley. Unhurried. A flashlight beam swung across the fence line, missed the doorway by 18 inches, came back, missed again. Gail was breathing so hard Harper could feel her ribs working. Harper found her wrist and pressed 2 fingers to the radial pulse, 140, thready, and held them there, steady, An absurd thing to do in an alley at 1 in the morning, and also the only thing available. The footsteps stopped 9 feet away. "Nothing back here," a voice said. "Check the far end." I did the far end. "Then do it again." The flashlight moved off. The footsteps followed it. 90 seconds later, a car started somewhere on the north side of the complex and pulled away without hurry. Harper waited another 4 minutes before she let Gail move. "You're not going to Fairlane tomorrow," she said. "You're going tonight, and not in your car. I can't just—" "Gail!" Harper's voice didn't rise. It just landed. "They came to your house. Whatever line you thought existed, it's not there." Gail stared at her in the dark. At the woman she'd worked beside for years, who'd always been the one who restocked the crash cart without being asked, who'd never once raised her voice at a resident, who had just moved through a black alley like the dark belonged to her. "Who are you?" Gail whispered. Harper took out her phone. "Somebody's going to call you in 20 minutes, she said. "Do exactly what they tell you." The person who called was Major Renata Hartley, and she did not do it from 20 minutes away. She did it from a parked sedan 4 blocks from Gail Ortega's townhouse, because she had been in Ashcroft City for 11 hours by then, and had simply not mentioned it. She met Harper at 5:20 a.m. in the back booth of a diner on Wexford Avenue that opened at 4 for the overnight cruise. Hartley was 51, gray at the temples, in a cheap civilian jacket that fit her badly and that she clearly did not care about. She had a coffee in front of her and hadn't touched it. "She's in a car heading east," Hartley said, "with 2 people I trust. The phone's already being imaged." "Good." "Sit down, Brooks." Harper sat. Hartley looked at her for a long moment. 3 years. "I sent a card." "You sent a card." Hartley's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. "Kess would have torn a strip off you for that." "Kess is dead, Ed." "I'm aware. I carried the box." Hartley finally picked up the coffee. "You look tired." "I work nights." "You look tired in a way that's got nothing to do with nights." She set the cup down again. "Reyes told you about Vance." "He told me 18 months. I think it's longer." "It's longer." Hartley slid a folded page across the table. Harper opened it and found a bank summary with the name and account numbers blacked out and the transfers left visible. Small amounts, regular, going back 4 years. "Consulting fees," Hartley said, "from a medical staffing firm that has 3 employees and no clients. And Redwood pays that firm. Redwood pays that firm $2.4 million a year for temp coverage that never arrives. Vance signs the invoices himself." Hartley took the page back. "The crew launders through it. The hospital eats the cost. And every time a staff member notices something they shouldn't, Vance's office is the one that decides whether it gets escalated." Harper turned her cup a quarter turn on the table. 6 incident reports. All closed. 22, Hartley said. Ortega only knew about her own. That landed harder than Harper expected. 22 times somebody at Redwood Memorial had walked into an office and said, "This is wrong," and been told, in 3 words, that they hadn't seen what they'd seen. 22 people who had learned that reporting things got you nothing. She thought about the culture of that floor, the way nobody escalated anymore, the way security calls got handled quietly, the way Mara Solano had said, "Don't make it a thing," about the man who'd been standing outside the break room in December. Harper had heard that and let it go. Because she was tired. Because it wasn't her department. Because she had 11 patients. She felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the diner's air conditioning. "How much of this did you already have before my name came up?" she asked. "Most of it." "Then why is Reyes standing in a parking garage telling a civilian nurse about a federal operation?" Hartley's expression didn't change. "Because 31 hours ago, somebody put in a records request on you. Sealed service jacket. Went through a state contractor with a hospital credentialing login." She let that sit exactly as long as it needed to. Vance's login. Harper went very still. "He doesn't have clearance for that jacket," Hartley said. "Nobody at that hospital does. But the request itself generated a flag, and the flag landed on a desk in a building where people remember your name, and that's why Reyes drove to a parking garage." Her eyes stayed level. "They can't read your file, Harper, but they know it exists, and they know it's sealed, which for men like these is worse, because now they think you're something they can't measure. So they'll try to make me small in a way they can measure." "They already started." Hartley reached into her jacket and put a phone on the table. face up. The screen showed a local news page time-stamped 4:47 a.m. Ashcroft nurse under investigation after violent parking garage assault. Hospital suspends employee pending review. There was a photo. Her hospital ID photo, the bad one from her second year, pulled from an internal system that no reporter should have had access to. Harper read the first 3 paragraphs. Then she read the quote in the 4th. Redwood Memorial holds its clinical staff to the highest standard of conduct, said Chief Medical Officer Dr. Elliot Vance. We are cooperating fully with authorities, and we have taken immediate steps to ensure our patients and personnel are protected. She set the phone down very gently, which anyone who had ever worked with her would have recognized as the most dangerous thing she could have done. He got ahead of it, she said. He got ahead of it. And it works, in the short term. Public suspension, cooperative posture, an employee who conveniently already has a police complaint filed against her by a man with a broken collarbone. Hartley leaned back. In 40 hours, it's dust. Today it's a rope around your neck. Ferris will file the charge. Ferris filed it at midnight. Harper looked up. There's a warrant, Hartley said. Aggravated assault. It gets served this morning, probably at your apartment, probably around 8, because Ferris is a by-the-book man who genuinely believes he's doing his job. She pushed the coffee aside. I can make it go away in about 6 hours. I can't make it go away in 6 minutes. So the question in front of you is whether you spend today in a holding cell keeping your head down, or whether you do something else. 6 hours, Harper said. 6 hours. Harper looked out the diner window. The sky over Wexford Avenue had gone the color of dishwater, that non-color at the front edge of a summer morning before anything committed. The reason Vance moved this fast, she said slowly, isn't me. Hartley waited. He's had 18 months of people noticing things, and he's shut all of it down with paperwork. He didn't need a press statement at 4 in the morning for one suspended nurse. Harper turned back. He's covering the window. He's making sure that whatever happens in the next 2 days, the story is already written, and I'm already in it. That's my read, too. What's happening in the next 2 days? For the first time, Hartley hesitated. Wexler talked at 2 a.m., she said. Not much. Enough. There's a shipment moving through Redwood's central supply on Thursday, pharmaceutical diversion, controlled substances, routed on a legitimate manifest through the loading dock during a scheduled inventory blackout. 6 figures, wholesale, 7 on the street. Thursday's tomorrow. Thursday was tomorrow. As of 4 hours ago, it's tonight. Hartley's jaw set. They moved it up, which means somebody inside told them we're close. Harper stood. Where are you going? To work, Harper said. Hartley put a hand flat on the table. You're suspended, you're on the news, and there's a warrant with your name on it. Then I've got about 2 hours before any of that catches me. Brooks? Renata. Harper said it quietly, and it stopped the older woman cold, because Harper had used her first name exactly twice in 9 years, and both of those times had involved someone dying. There are 94 people on that floor tonight. Patients, nurses who filed reports and got told they were wrong. A charge nurse who's 41 weeks from retirement. She pulled her jacket off the hook. And a man who's about to run a controlled substance diversion through a working trauma center during an inventory blackout, which means for 2 hours the pharmacy log goes dark and nobody can pull anything without a manual override. Hartley's face changed. Yeah, Harper said. You were thinking about the drugs. I'm thinking about a coding patient at 11 p.m. who needs something out of a cabinet that's locked. She was at the door before Hartley spoke again. They will not see you coming, Hartley said. They still think you're a nurse. Harper pushed the door open into the gray morning. I am a nurse, she said. She did not go to her apartment. She went to a 24-hour laundromat on Cordell and paid a woman $40 to let her change in the back, and then to a supply store where she bought 2 sets of Navy scrubs off the rack with cash. The badge was the problem. Her badge was on a table in conference room B. She solved it at 6:50 a.m. in the Redwood Memorial Cafeteria, which was open to the public, by sitting near the door with a cup of coffee and watching the shift change until she spotted a second-year resident named Paolo Rennick, who had been on the receiving end of one of her better saves in March, and who owed her, in his own estimation, roughly his entire professional life. He sat down across from her with his mouth already open. Don't, she said. You're on the news. I know. Harper, They sent an all-staff email at 5 in the morning. There's a paragraph about you. Solano's been in Vance's office twice already, and she came out the second time and threw a clipboard. Good for her. Harper leaned forward. Paolo. Central Supply runs an inventory blackout tonight. Do you know when? He blinked. Yeah, they posted it. 9 to 11. Pixis goes to manual override. Everything gets logged on paper and reconciled in the morning. Who authorized it? CMO's office, I guess? That's who signs off on... He stopped. His face did something complicated. Why are you asking me that? Because I'm suspended and I can't look it up. That's not an answer. He rubbed his hands over his face. God, you're going to get me fired. No, Harper said. I'm going to get you to walk out of here in 10 minutes and forget we talked. And then tonight you're going to have a very ordinary shift where nothing unusual happens. And if anything does happen, you're going to be nowhere near it. She held his eyes. That's the whole thing. That's all of it. Paolo sat there for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat, took out a folded printout of the Central Supply schedule that he'd apparently been carrying since 5 a.m. for reasons he probably couldn't have explained, and slid it across the table. Solano told me to give you this if I saw you, he said. She said, her words, tell her the hospital is wrong, and I'm sorry, and I'll say it out loud when it counts. Harper took the paper. She looked at it for 4 seconds longer than she needed to. Tell her thank you, she said. At 7:40 a.m., Lieutenant Gary Ferris knocked on the door of apartment 3C on Decatur Street with 2 uniformed officers and a warrant for the arrest of Harper Brooks. Nobody answered. At 7:52, the building manager let them in, and Ferris walked through 3 small clean rooms and found no one, and stood in the second bedroom looking at a wall of paperback novels and medical texts with the particular unease of a man who has just realized his understanding of a situation may be incomplete. He noticed the door frame. He noticed the window lock. He was a good enough cop to notice the strip of tape hanging split off the sash. He was standing there, phone to his ear, when the department's records liaison told him that the sealed jacket flag on Harper Brooks had been escalated to a federal desk 28 hours earlier, and that he was to hold service of the warrant pending review. Hold it, Ferris repeated. On what grounds? The answer took 40 seconds to deliver. When it was finished, Ferris stood in the empty apartment for a while without saying anything at all. Then he called his sergeant and said, We've got a problem, and it isn't the nurse. Harper spent the day in the last place anyone would look for her, which was the 4th floor of the Ashcroft City Public Library, in a study carrel with a view of nothing, working through the Central Supply schedule line by line. The blackout window was 9 to 11, as Paolo said, but the schedule showed something else. A scheduled maintenance shutdown on the loading dock camera array from 8:45 to 11:15, filed under a facilities work order for conduit inspection. 2.5 hours of no video on a dock that would be receiving a legitimate manifest during a 2-hour pharmacy blackout. She sat back and did the arithmetic on how many hands that required. Central Supply. Facilities. Security scheduling. Pharmacy. Somebody in administration to sign the work order. 5 departments. That wasn't a bribe. That was an organization. At 4:15 p.m., her phone buzzed with a message from an unregistered number. Warrant held. You're clear until at least tomorrow. Do not go to that hospital. Reyes has the dock. We move at 2100. Harper read it twice. Then she opened the schedule again and looked at the one line she'd been circling all afternoon without wanting to say it out loud. The manifest wasn't arriving at the loading dock. It was arriving at sterile receiving, a separate bay on the north side, 1 level down, used for surgical instrument returns, which had its own door, its own log, and no camera at all because the room had never held anything worth stealing. Reyes had the wrong dock. She was already standing when she typed the reply, 3 words, and hit send. North Bay. Sterile. Delivered. No response. She waited 90 seconds. 2 minutes. 4. Nothing. She called. It rang 11 times and died into nothing. No voicemail. No carrier message. Just the flat click of a line that had stopped existing. Harper stood in the 4th floor stacks of the Ashcroft City Public Library with the phone against her ear and the afternoon light going long and orange across the carpet. And she understood, with the specific clarity that had kept her alive in 4 countries she'd never be able to name, that the number had been burned. which meant it had been compromised, which meant that every message she'd sent to it since 5 o'clock that morning had gone somewhere. At 8:51 p.m., under a work order nobody would question, the camera array on the north side of Redwood Memorial Hospital went dark. And at 8:58, in the trauma bay on the ground floor, the emergency line rang with the first call of a mass casualty event that had not happened yet. The call came in on the red line, which meant county dispatch, which meant it was already real before anyone at Redwood Memorial had a chance to decide how they felt about it. The charge nurse that night was Delphine Aduba, 63 years old, 41 weeks out from a retirement. She talked about the way some people talk about a country they've never been to. She took the handset off the wall with her left hand because her right was holding a stack of transfer orders, and she listened for 11 seconds before the orders hit the floor. Say it again. Multi-vehicle, Cordell and 8th, box truck into a loaded transit bus. Dispatch was talking fast and clipped. 15 minimum. That number's going to move. St. Anthony's is on divert for the north side, so you're primary. First units are 4 minutes out. 4 minutes. There are people still inside the vehicle. Delphine hung up and hit the overhead. Trauma alert. Mass casualty. Activate the plan. Her voice came out flat and enormous through the ceiling speakers. The voice of a woman who had done this 6 times in 38 years and had never once let it show in her hands. Everybody who's on, everybody who's off and still in the building. 4 minutes. The floor went from tired to detonating in the space of a breath. Mara Solano came out of the physician's room at a run with her hair half out of its clip, already counting bays out loud, already shouting for the second attending who was upstairs and would not make it down for 6 minutes. Paolo Rennick nearly went over a linen cart. Somebody's dinner got knocked off the desk and nobody picked it up. 2 techs started clearing Bay 2 of a patient who did not want to be cleared. And at the pharmacy station, a nurse named Isolde Mbeki put her badge against the reader for the 3rd time and got the same 3 amber words she'd gotten twice already. Manual override. Inventory hold. Delphine. She turned around. Delphine, the Pyxis is down. What? The whole cabinet. Manual override. 9 to 11. Isolde's voice cracked in the middle of it. It's the blackout. It's tonight. Delphine Aduba looked at the wall clock, which read 9:03, and then at the doors, and then at the 22 people on her floor who were about to receive 15 bodies with no controlled substances they could pull without a paper requisition and a signature from a supervising physician who was currently in a stairwell. Get me the pharmacy manager, she said. Get me anybody in pharmacy. I called twice. Then call a 3rd time. Nobody answered in pharmacy because pharmacy's overnight lead had been reassigned that afternoon to assist with an inventory reconciliation on the north side of the building, on a work order signed by an office that had signed a great many work orders that month. Check. Harper heard the sirens before she saw anything. She was 2 blocks out, on foot, moving north up Cordell, against a river of stopped traffic. She'd left the library at 8:53 with a burned phone number and a bad feeling and no plan more sophisticated than get eyes on the North Bay, and then the night had done what nights did and rewritten the whole problem in 90 seconds. At the corner of Cordell and 9th, she stopped and looked down the long slope of the avenue toward 8th, where the intersection was full of light, the wrong kind, red and white and stuttering, and underneath it the shape of a transit bus lying at an angle no bus should ever lie at. She stood there for exactly 2 seconds. The tactical read said, "This is cover." Somebody had moved a shipment from Thursday to Wednesday, and now on Wednesday night the primary trauma center in the South Corridor was about to be swallowed whole by a mass casualty. Coincidence was possible. She'd stopped believing in it around age 20. The other read, the one that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with 11 years of night shifts, said, "There are 15 people in that intersection." She went to the intersection, not because it was the correct decision, because her legs were already moving before the argument finished, which was, she'd found, how most of the real decisions in her life had gotten made. The scene was bad in the specific way that scenes were bad before the resources arrived. Too much light, not enough hands, everybody's voice at the wrong pitch, 2 engine companies, 1 medic unit, a police sergeant trying to hold a perimeter with 3 officers and a roll of tape. Harper walked up to the nearest medic, a kid who couldn't have been 3 years out of school, and said, "Who's running triage?" Nobody yet. The supervisor's stuck on the other side of the, "You are now. Where's your tag pack?" He handed it over without asking who she was, which told her everything about how far past capacity he already was. She started at the front of the bus and worked backward. The first man she reached was breathing at 40 a minute with a chest that wasn't moving symmetrically and a trachea that had started to walk. She said, "Flail with likely tension. He needs a needle now." And the medic said, "I've never..." And she said, "Then watch me and then you'll have." And she did it with the kit off his belt, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular, and the hiss that came back was the loudest quiet sound in the world. Red tag. The next one was walking around with a scalp laceration bleeding theatrically down his shirt and asking about his phone. Green tag. The one after that was a woman in her 60s trapped under a seat frame with a leg that was clearly open book at the pelvis and a radial pulse Harper couldn't find. Red tag, and a word to the engine lieutenant about the extrication order that changed the order. The fourth was a teenage girl, 17 or 18, sitting upright against the curb with her hands folded in her lap, perfectly calm, saying nothing. Harper crouched. "Hey, what's your name?" The girl looked at her. "Can you tell me your name?" Nothing. Pupils unequal. A soft, boggy area above the left ear that Harper found with 2 fingers and immediately wished she hadn't. "Okay," Harper said quietly. "Okay, sweetheart." Red tag. She stood up and her hands were shaking, and she noted that with complete detachment, the way she'd note a lab value, and kept moving. By 9:19, she had 21 patients tagged, 4 of them red, 2 of them expectant, and a triage sector that was functioning because somebody had made it function. The medic supervisor arrived at 9:22, took one look at the tag distribution and the order of the loading and said, "Who set this up?" "I did," Harper said. "You county?" "No." He looked at her scrubs, which were the wrong navy for any service on scene, and at her hands, and made the only decision that mattered, which was to not have the argument. "Fine. Ride in with the second unit." "I'm not riding in," Harper said. "I'm walking. I'll be there before you are." She was. She came in through the ambulance bay at 9:31 in the middle of a stream of gurneys, and for 11 seconds nobody noticed her, because in a mass casualty nobody notices anything but the next set of hands. Delphina Duba noticed at second 12. The charge nurse stopped in the middle of the floor with a bag of saline in each hand and stared. "You are not supposed to be here." "I know." "There's a warrant. It's on hold." Harper took one of the bags out of her hand. "Delphine, what's your controlled sub situation?" Delphine's face did something that in a less disciplined woman would have been the start of crying. "We have nothing," she said. "Cabinet's locked out till 11. I've got 4 reds coming and no fentanyl, no ketamine, no rocuronium, and Solano's about to intubate a 50-year-old on nothing but a prayer she doesn't say out loud. Who has override authority? Pharmacy lead, nursing supervisor, CMO's office." "Where's the pharmacy lead?" "North side, reassigned, nobody's answering." Harper set the saline bag down on the counter. Something in the way she did it made Delphina Duba stop talking. "Who signed the reassignment?" Harper said. "Harper." "Delphine, who signed it?" The older woman's mouth flattened into a hard line. "Same office that signed the camera work order," she said. "Same office that signed the blackout. Same office that put your face on the news at 5 o'clock this morning." Behind them, the doors banged open and a gurney came through with the flail chest man on it, the medic bagging him, somebody shouting for a chest tube tray. "Go," Delphine said. "I mean it. Go to Bay 1 and don't let anybody look at your badge, because you don't have one, and I am going to spend the rest of my career pretending I didn't see you walk in that door." Harper went to Bay 1. For the next 50 minutes she was, in every meaningful sense, exactly what her file said she was: an emergency nurse in a trauma bay during a mass casualty. She held cricoid pressure while Mara Solano got a tube into the flail chest man on a rapid sequence that had no paralytic in it, which meant it wasn't rapid, and it wasn't a sequence. It was 2 people wrestling a laryngoscope against a gag reflex and a rising heart rate. It worked on the 3rd attempt. It should have worked on the 1st. Solano came off it white and furious. "That's malpractice," she said. I just did that to a human being because a cabinet is locked." "I know." "Do you know what he's going to remember about tonight?" "Yes," Harper said. "So do I." She ran 2 units of O-neg into the pelvis fracture and packed the wound with a lieutenant's worth of gauze, while the ortho resident cursed at a pelvic binder that had been stocked in the wrong size. She did a cut-down line on a 22-year-old whose veins had gone flat and whose pressure was in the 60s, and the cut-down was ugly, and she knew it was ugly, and it ran anyway. She lost the teenage girl at 10:04. It wasn't dramatic. It never was. The girl went from a Glasgow of 9 to a Glasgow of 5 to a blown pupil in 19 minutes, and neurosurgery was in an elevator, and by the time they got her upstairs, there wasn't much left to decompress. Harper heard the call over the phone from the OR while she was elbow deep in somebody else's abdomen, holding retraction because there was no one else to hold it. She said, "Copy." That was all she said. She'd learned a long time ago that you got to have your reaction later, and if you took it early, it came out of somebody else's account. At 10:41, Paolo Rennick found her at the sink. "Harper, not now. Harper, there's a truck at sterile receiving." She turned off the water. "Say that again." "North Bay. Sterile receiving. I went down to grab an instrument set because Central Supply's not answering either, and there's a truck backed into a bay that hasn't taken a delivery in 2 years, and there are 4 guys in facilities coveralls moving crates." His hands were doing something helpless. "And the corridor doors chalked open with a fire extinguisher." Harper looked at the clock. 10:42. 18 minutes of blackout left. 33 minutes of dead camera. "Where's security?" "That's the thing." Paolo swallowed. "Half the night detail got pulled to the ambulance bay for crowd control. There's one guy on the whole north side and he's sitting in his car." Harper dried her hands. "Okay," she said. "Okay what?" "Harper, okay what?" She was already walking. Awesome. She took the service stairwell because the elevators were full of gurneys and because stairwells had corners, and corners were the only architectural feature that had ever done her any favors. On the landing between 2 and 1, she stopped and did the thing she hadn't let herself do all night, which was think about the shape of it. The camera work order was filed a week ago. The pharmacy blackout was scheduled a week ago. The pharmacy lid was reassigned this afternoon. The shipment was moved from Thursday to Wednesday, sometime in the last 20 hours. After Wexler talked, after a federal desk started paying attention. But the bus crash was tonight. And a bus crash was not something you scheduled, which meant either the universe had handed Elliot Vance the single greatest piece of luck of his criminal career, or Harper stopped on the stairs. Or somebody had looked at a city with one primary trauma center on the south side and a second facility already on divert, and understood that if the primary went to mass casualty, every warm body with a radio and a 4-block radius would flow toward the ambulance bay like water down a drain, and the north side of the building would be empty for 2 hours. She thought about a box truck. She thought about how a box truck ends up inside a loaded transit bus at 8:58 p.m. at an intersection 4 blocks from a hospital. She thought about a 17-year-old girl sitting on a curb with her hands folded in her lap. Harper put her hand flat against the stairwell wall and stood there for 8 seconds with her eyes closed. When she opened them, something in her face had changed in a way that no one at Redwood Memorial had ever seen, and that 3 men in a parking garage would have recognized immediately. She went down the last flight. Sterile receiving was a long concrete room with a roll door at one end and a double door to the corridor at the other, lit by 2 banks of fluorescents, of which one was working. The truck was backed in with its rear doors open. 4 men in gray coveralls were moving plastic crates from a pallet jack into the truck bed, with the unhurried competence of people who had been told this would take 90 minutes and were 40 minutes ahead of schedule. Harper watched them for 2 minutes from the corridor door, which was, as Paolo had said, chalked open with a fire extinguisher. 4 men, 1 pallet jack, 2 crates left on the floor and maybe 9 already loaded. No visible long guns. At least 2 of them were carrying something under the coveralls at the hip. She could see it in the way they turned. A 5th man stood by the roll door with a clipboard and a radio, and he was not in coveralls. He was in a suit. She recognized him from a photograph. Hartley had shown her at 5:20 that morning. Deacon Ruel, 44, the man whose name sat between the Burnside crew and the staffing firm that had no clients, the middle layer that made the whole structure work. Harper's phone was dead weight in her pocket. The number was burned. Calling 911 got her a dispatcher who would route it to a security office that was down to 1 man in a car. Calling the police got Ferris, who was 6 hours behind and holding a warrant with her name on it. She had, by her count, about 11 minutes before the crates were loaded and the truck was gone and none of this had ever happened. So she picked up the fire extinguisher. The corridor door swung shut behind her with a hydraulic sigh, and Harper walked into sterile receiving carrying a red cylinder in one hand like a woman on an errand, in scrubs, with somebody else's blood dried to the knuckles of her right hand. The nearest coverall saw her first. Hey, you can't be down here. There's a mass casualty upstairs, Harper said, still walking. I need instrument sets. Not tonight, you don't. Turn around. Room's not secured. Turn around. She was 9 feet from him. Deacon Rule looked up from the clipboard, and Harper saw the exact instant he recognized her. The small stillness that came over him, the recalibration, the way his eyes went from a nurse to a photograph on a news site to a name in a sealed file that nobody could read. That's her, Rule said. Everything after that took 19 seconds. The first man came at her with his hand going to his hip, and Harper swung the extinguisher into the outside of his knee, which folded the wrong direction with a sound that would have made a surgeon wince, and then she was past him and inside the reach of the second one before he'd finished turning. She did not fight the way people fought in movies. There was nothing decorative in it. She went for the structures that broke, the knee, the collarbone, the small joints of the hand that held the weapon. She took a fist to the ribs on the left side that she felt land badly, felt something give a little, and she filed it under later and kept moving. The second man's pistol came out, and she trapped his wrist against the pallet jack and put her elbow into the radial nerve twice, and the gun clattered under the truck, and she let him fall. The third one got behind her. That was the mistake. Hers, not his. She'd counted 4 and tracked 3, because the fourth had been on the far side of the truck bed, and she'd let herself lose him for 2 seconds. And 2 seconds was the entire distance between competence and the floor. He got an arm across her throat. Harper dropped her weight instead of pulling against it, tucked her chin hard into the crook of his elbow to buy a half-inch of airway, and drove her heel down the length of his shin onto the small bones of his foot. He grunted and didn't let go. She got 2 fingers under the arm, found the ulnar side, and did something with her thumb that made him scream and let go at the same time, and then she put him into the concrete pillar face first, and he stayed there. The fourth man had the gun from under the truck. Harper stopped. He was 8 feet away with it in both hands, breathing hard, and he was maybe 23 years old and his arms were not steady. Down, he said. On the ground. Down. You don't want to do that. Shut up. Look at your hands, Harper said quietly. They're shaking. That's adrenaline. That's normal. But it means you're going to pull instead of squeeze, and at 8 feet you're going to miss me by about a foot to the left, and then I'm going to be on you before your second round. She hadn't moved. You've got one good decision left tonight, and it's the one you make in the next 4 seconds. The barrel wavered. Put it down, she said, and I'll tell them you did. And it might have worked. Harper genuinely thought it was working, thought she saw the shoulders start to drop, except that Deacon Rule shot the man in the back. The sound in that concrete room was enormous. The kid went down face first with a look of complete confusion, and Ruel stepped over him and picked the gun up off the floor and turned it on Harper in one movement that was entirely too practiced. He was going to take a deal, Ruel said by way of explanation. You people always talk them into it. Harper hadn't moved. Her hands were open at her sides. He needs pressure on that wound, she said. He needs to be quiet. Ruel's face was perfectly composed. Kneel down. He's got an entry through the lower back. If it clipped the aorta, he's got about 4 minutes. If it didn't, he's got maybe 40 and he keeps his legs. Kneel down. Let me put pressure on him. Ruel looked at her for a long moment with something like genuine bafflement. You're standing there with a gun on you, he said, asking to help him. Yeah, Harper said. She was already lowering herself slowly, hands visible, and she did not kneel. She went down onto one knee beside the kid on the floor and put both palms flat over the entry wound and leaned her weight into it. The blood came up through her fingers immediately and warm. Nobody moves, Ruel said into his radio. We're 20 minutes out. Load it. The 2 men who could still stand started loading again. And Harper knelt on the concrete floor of sterile receiving with her hands inside a stranger's back and counted. She counted the crates going into the truck. 9, 10, 11. She counted the seconds between the roll door motor kicking on and off. She counted her own pulse, which was 104, which was too high, and which she brought down by breathing in a pattern she'd learned in a garage in the winter from a man with a face like weathered stone. And she counted the distance to the fire extinguisher, which was lying 11 feet away against the base of the pillar, and which had a pin, and which was, functionally, a pressurized cylinder in a small enclosed concrete room. At 10:57, the last crate went into the truck. At 10:58, Deacon Rule said, "Get her up. She rides with us." And at 10:59, the corridor door, the one that had swung shut behind her, the one with the hydraulic closer, the one that only opened from the inside with a badge, opened. Harper didn't look up. She kept her hands where they were. What she heard was a voice she knew from the doorway, saying 8 words in a tone she had never in 11 years heard Delphine Aduba use. "Get away from her, right now, all of you." Ruel turned toward the door with the gun coming up. Behind Delphine, filling the corridor, were 19 people in scrubs. Mara Solano, Isolde Mbeki, Paolo Rennick with a chest tube tray in his hands like a shield, 2 orderlies, a respiratory tech who'd been on shift for 16 hours, the entire night float. They had no weapons. Several of them were crying. They came through the doorway anyway, and they kept coming, and they filled the room, and the 2 men in coveralls stopped moving because there was nowhere left to move to. "You want to shoot somebody," Delphine said. "You're going to have to pick." Rule's arm didn't waver, but his eyes moved, left, right, counting, and Harper watched him count and watched him arrive at a number he didn't like. "Back up," he said. Nobody backed up. And in the 2 seconds while Deacon Rule recalculated the entire architecture of his night, Harper Brooks lifted one hand off the kid's back, reached sideways without standing, and closed her fingers around the base of the fire extinguisher. She never got to use it. Because the roll door at the far end of sterile receiving came up all at once, the motor screaming, the slats hammering into their track. And behind it, filling the loading apron in a wall of white light and diesel and men in plates and helmets moving in a wedge, was the response element that Reyes had spent 11 hours staging at the wrong dock. "Federal agents, down, down, down." Ruel dropped the gun. The coveralls went to the floor, the room filled with light and shouting and boots, and Harper stayed exactly where she was, on one knee, both hands back in the wound, because the kid's pressure was dropping and everything else in the world had just become somebody else's problem. A gloved hand landed on her shoulder. A voice she recognized as Reyes said, "Brooks, you hit?" "Not me. Him." She didn't look up. "Through and through lower back, entry left of L2, I've got venous, but I don't know about arterial. I need a stretcher, and I need it in 90 seconds. Copy that." "Reyes." "Yeah." "How did you know?" Harper said. "The number was burned. I sent that message into nothing." There was a pause above her. Half a second, no more. "Your message never reached us," Reyes said. Harper looked up, and Reyes was holding a phone, and on its screen was a text sent at 5:04 that afternoon from a number Harper didn't recognize, and it said, "She's right. North Bay, sterile receiving. He's moving it tonight. Evie." Harper stared at the initials. "That's not possible," she said. "We got it 4 hours ago," Reyes said. "We couldn't verify it, so we split the element. Half on the dock, half here." He crouched down beside her, and his face was not the face of a man delivering good news. "Brooks." Vance turned himself in at 4 o'clock this afternoon. The kid under Harper's hands made a small sound. "He walked into the federal building on Halstead with a lawyer and 11 boxes of documents," Reyes said, "and the first thing he said, before he sat down, before anything, was your name." Harper didn't answer. The kid's pressure was the only sentence in her head that mattered, and it was getting shorter. "Stretcher," she said. 90 seconds. "He doesn't have 90 seconds. Get me a backboard and 4 hands and we carry him." They carried him. 2 federal medics, Harper and Paolo Rennick, who had never in his life run that fast with something that heavy, up the north service ramp and through a corridor and into an elevator that stank of blood and diesel. And the whole way Harper kept both palms sealed over the entry wound with her forearms locked straight and her body weight stacked over them, because it was the only pressure that was doing anything, and she had no intention of removing it until somebody with a clamp took it from her. They got him into Bay 3 at 11:06. Mara Solano met them at the door with her gloves already on. "Talk to me." 23-year-old male, single, GSW, entry left paraspinal at L2, no exit. I can find. Initial pressure was palpable radial, and it's not now. He's had, Harper glanced at the clock, 9 minutes of direct pressure and about 2 liters on the floor. Any response? I was talking at 8 minutes. He's not now. Solano got a finger on the neck, found something, didn't like it. Massive transfusion protocol. Somebody call the OR and tell them I don't care what's on the board. She looked at Harper's hands. Don't move those yet. I wasn't going to. They worked on him for 41 minutes. He went upstairs at 11:47 with a pressure of 88, and a surgeon who would spend the next 4 hours finding out what a 9mm round does to the retroperitoneum. He lived. That was not obvious at the time, and Harper did not learn it until the following afternoon, but he lived, and 11 weeks later a woman Harper had never met would send a letter to Redwood Memorial's administration that got read aloud at a meeting Harper deliberately did not attend. At 11:49, Harper walked out of Bay 3 and put her back against the corridor wall and slid down it until she was sitting on the floor. That was where the pain in her left side finally arrived. The shot she'd taken from the second man, the one she'd filed under later. Later had come. She pressed 2 fingers along the 8th and 9th ribs and felt the crepitus and the sharp, bright edge of it, and thought, with complete clinical detachment, 2 fractured, probably no pneumo, probably. Then she leaned her head back against the wall and started shaking. Not a little. A full-body tremor that started in her hands and moved up through the shoulders, teeth chattering, the whole ugly parasympathetic bill coming due all at once now that there was nothing left to spend it on. Delphina Duba found her like that 4 minutes later and sat down on the floor beside her, 63 years old, in a hallway, with her knees up, which she would later say was the hardest physical thing she did that entire night. Neither of them talked for a while. You came down there, Harper said eventually. With 19 people. 22. 3 didn't fit in the corridor. Delphine's voice was steady and enormously tired. You want to know the truth? I didn't decide anything. Rennick came up those stairs saying your name and I said, we're going, and then I turned around and everybody was already standing up. Harper closed her eyes. You could have all been killed. Yes. That was a bad call. It was a terrible call, Delphine agreed. I'd make it again. The first arrest wave hit at 12:20 a.m. By 2:00, 11 people were in federal custody. Deacon Rule, the 4 men from sterile receiving, including the one in surgery, the security supervisor who had approved the North Side detail reduction, a facilities coordinator who had filed the camera work order, the central supply manager who had signed the manifest, a pharmacy administrator who had reassigned the overnight lead, and a woman from the CMO's own office named Diane Pruitt, who had called Harper on a Tuesday morning to summon her to Conference Room B and who wept in the back of a federal vehicle for 40 straight minutes without saying anything coherent. By 4 o'clock, the number was 19. By the end of the week, it would be 31, and it would include a captain in the Ashcroft PD's South Division and 2 members of the hospital's Board of Trustees. Harper learned most of that later. What she learned at 3:15 a.m. in a windowless room in a federal building on Halstead Street with a cup of terrible coffee and 2 cracked ribs and dried blood in the creases of both palms because she had not yet been allowed to wash properly was what Elliot Vance had actually done. Major Renata Hartley told her. Reyes was there too, and a woman from the U.S. Attorney's Office named Ines Barrow, who took notes and said almost nothing for the first hour. He came in at 4 o'clock, Hartley said. Attorney, 11 boxes, and a proffer letter his lawyer had drafted 3 days ago, which means he made the decision on Sunday. Before the garage. 2 days before the garage. Harper turned the coffee cup a quarter turn on the table. Then what happened Sunday? Hartley opened a folder and slid a photograph across. It was a girl. 15, maybe 16. School photo. Blue background. Braces. Camille Vance, Hartley said. His daughter. Sophomore at Ashcroft Country Day. She paused. On Saturday evening, somebody put a photograph of her under the windshield wiper of her mother's car, taken through a classroom window at 11:40 in the morning. On the back, it said she has a nice laugh. Harper looked at the picture for a long time. So he didn't grow a conscience, she said. He got scared. That's correct. He took their money for 4 years. That's also correct. 22 incident reports came across his desk, and he closed every one of them with the same 3 words, and people lost their jobs, and Gail Ortega spent 7 months in a townhouse with the blinds down. Harper. And then somebody put a photograph on his car, and suddenly he found 11 boxes of documents. Yes, Hartley said. Harper set the cup down. I'm not going to pretend that's a redemption, she said. I want that on whatever record this is. Inez Barrow looked up from her notes for the first time. Nobody in this room thinks it is, she said. He's going to prison. The cooperation moves the number. It doesn't move the outcome. She capped her pen. But I'll tell you what he did do, and you can decide how much you care. At 5:04 yesterday afternoon, he was in a proffer session with me and my colleague. Somebody had passed him a note that a message had come in flagging a location. He was told, explicitly, by his own attorney, to say nothing further until his agreement was signed. And he stood up, Barrow said, and told us that a nurse named Harper Brooks was right, that the shipment had been moved to that night, that it was going through sterile receiving and not the dock, and that if we didn't send people there in the next 4 hours, she was going to walk into it alone. The room was quiet. He didn't have to say the last part, Barrow said. The last part is why we split the element. Harper looked at the tabletop. He's still going to prison, she said. He is. Good. They let her go at 6:40 in the morning. Reyes drove her home, and neither of them spoke for the first 15 minutes. And then he said, You could have called it in from the corridor, waited. 11 minutes. 11 minutes and you'd have had a team. I'd have had a team 11 minutes after the truck left. She watched the city go by, gray and starting up. You want me to say I made a good decision? I didn't. I made a fast one. Sometimes those overlap. Reyes let that sit. The kid you kept your hands on, he said. Tobin Marsh, 23. He'd been with them 6 months, mostly driving. A pause. His lawyer's already talking. He's going to hand us the whole logistics chain. That's not why I did it. I know, Reyes said. That's why it worked. Ashcroft City woke up on Thursday to a story that had completely reversed direction overnight. At 7 a.m., the local outlets were still running the version from 24 hours earlier. The nurse, the assault, the suspension. By 9:30, they were running federal press releases. By noon, the first of the arrest photographs were out, and by 6 in the evening, every station in the market was leading with the same 4 words in some arrangement: Redwood Memorial, federal indictment. Harper's name was in almost none of it, which had been a specific and deliberate request, and which held for exactly 31 hours. It broke on Friday afternoon when a local reporter named Sylvia Okonkwo, who was good at her job and not particularly interested in doing anyone favors, obtained the sterile receiving incident summary and found in it a line describing a hospital employee who had entered the bay alone, disabled 3 armed subjects, and provided sustained hemorrhage control on a gunshot victim while a firearm was pointed at her. She published it at 4:15 p.m. By 4:40, there were vans on Decatur Street. Harper watched them from behind the blind for about 90 seconds, then packed a bag, took the service stairs down to the basement, went out through the maintenance entrance that opened onto the alley behind the building, and walked 8 blocks to a motel on Wexford, where she paid cash and slept for 14 hours. She woke up at an hour Saturday morning to 61 missed calls, 4 of which were from Mara Solano, and 1 of which was from a number in the 202 area code that she did not return. The hearing was on the following Wednesday. Not a criminal proceeding. Those would take 18 months. This was the emergency session of Redwood Memorial's Board of Trustees, convened under the hospital's own bylaws, held in the 6th-floor auditorium because the boardroom couldn't hold the people who insisted on being there. 240 seats, every one of them full, standing along both walls. Nurses off shift and nurses on shift who'd swapped out to be there. Techs, housekeeping staff. 3 residents who'd driven back from a conference. The pharmacy overnight lead who'd been reassigned. Gail Ortega, up from Fairlane, sitting in the 4th row in a blazer with her sister beside her. Harper sat in the second-to-last row on the aisle, in street clothes, with a hood down and her hair loose, which she had genuinely believed would be enough. It was not enough. 11 people recognized her within 4 minutes. She stopped counting after that. The interim chief executive, a woman named Rosalind Tavernier, who had been flown in from the system's regional office 4 days earlier and looked like she had slept exactly as much as everyone else, opened at 10 a.m. by reading a statement. She got 3 sentences in before somebody in the 5th row said, "Louder." Tavernier looked up. She was maybe 55, and she had the specific expression of an executive who has done crisis management before and has never done it in a room like this one. She set the statement down. "I'm going to stop reading this," she said, "because it was written by attorneys and it is designed to be defensible. And I've been in this building for 4 days, and what I've learned is that defensible language is exactly what got you all here." The room changed temperature. "So here's what I actually know," Tavernier said. "Between March of 4 years ago and last Wednesday, this hospital paid $2.4 million a year to a staffing firm that provided nothing. The invoices were approved by the Office of the Chief Medical Officer. Between January of last year and last Wednesday, 22 incident reports concerning threats, intimidation, or unauthorized persons in secure areas were filed by clinical staff. All 22 were closed by the same office, using the same 3-word justification, in an average of 31 hours. Somewhere in the middle of the room, a woman made a sound. 6 of those were filed by Ms. Gail Ortega, who was terminated in a manner this board is now reviewing, and which I will tell you frankly, appears to have been retaliatory." Tavernier's eyes moved across the room. 9 days ago, an employee of this hospital reported a firearm in a trauma bay. She followed protocol exactly. Within 9 hours, she had been suspended, stripped of her credentials, and named in a press statement issued by this institution at 4:47 in the morning. The room was completely silent now. That statement was authored by the same office. Tavernier put both hands flat on the podium. "Last Wednesday night," she said, "during a mass casualty event in which this hospital received 21 patients from a collision on Cordell Avenue, our controlled substance cabinets were locked out under a scheduled inventory hold that had been placed there for the express purpose of concealing a theft. Dr. Solano performed an emergency intubation on a conscious patient without paralytics because of that lockout. That patient is alive. He is also, I am told, having significant difficulty sleeping." Mara Solano, in the 3rd row, put her hand over her mouth. "I want to be extremely clear about something," Tavernier said. "That was not a failure of our nurses. That was not a failure of our physicians. Every single person in this room did their job under conditions that were deliberately engineered to make their jobs impossible. The failure was administrative, it was criminal, and it was located in an office that reported directly to this board." She looked down at her notes and then didn't use them. "This board did not ask enough questions. I have been here 4 days and I can see that from the minutes. That's not a legal admission. My attorneys are going to be unhappy with me, and I don't particularly care." Somebody in the back started to clap and stopped, because it wasn't that kind of moment. Tavernier waited a beat. "Harper Brooks's suspension is rescinded, retroactive, with a full expungement of the personnel record and a written finding that she acted correctly at every stage. The criminal complaint against her has been withdrawn by the Ashcroft County District Attorney's Office as of Monday. Gail Ortega has been offered reinstatement at her prior seniority with full back pay, and whether she takes it is entirely her business." She paused. "And effective immediately, incident reports at this institution do not go to a single office. They go to a 3-person panel with a nursing representative elected by the nursing staff, and every report gets a written disposition with a name attached to it. If somebody wants to close a report, they can put their signature on it and defend it out loud." That was when the room applauded, and it went on longer than was comfortable, and a substantial number of people were not applauding the reforms so much as the fact that anyone had finally said any of it in a room with the lights on. Then Tavernier said, "Ms. Brooks, if you're here, the floor is yours." 240 people turned around. Set. Harper stood up because standing seemed marginally less awful than not standing. She did not walk to the front. She stayed at her seat in the second-to-last row with one hand on the chair in front of her, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet enough that people in the front had to lean. "I'd rather not," she said. There was a ripple of laughter, startled, affectionate. "I mean it, I'm not—" She stopped, started again. "There's a version of this where I'm the story. I've watched that version get made before. It's not accurate, and it's not useful." She looked at the ceiling for a second. "On Wednesday night, there were 21 patients in this building and about 90 staff. I was in a room in the basement for 19 seconds that people are going to talk about for a year. In that same 19 seconds, Isolde Mbeki was handwriting controlled substance requisitions on paper because the system was down, and getting them signed and getting drugs into patients who needed them, which is the least dramatic thing that happened that night, and probably saved more people than I did. She found Delphine Aduba in the crowd. "And when it went bad down there, the reason I'm standing here is not because of anything I did. It's because a 63-year-old charge nurse walked into an armed robbery in progress with 22 unarmed people behind her, which was an insane decision, and which was also the single bravest thing I have ever personally witnessed. And I want to be specific that I have witnessed a considerable amount." Delphine looked at the floor and did not look up for a while. "One more thing, and then I'm going to sit down." Harper's hand tightened on the chair back. 22 reports. Everybody in this room heard that number this morning and made a face. I want to say out loud that I never filed one, not once in 11 years. In December, there was a man standing outside the break room who didn't belong there, and I mentioned it to somebody, and I let it go because I was tired and it wasn't my department, and I had 11 patients. The silence in the room had changed shape. That's not humility, it's just true. The system worked on all of us. It made reporting feel pointless, and then it made pointless feel normal. She looked around. So the panel Ms. Tavernier just described only matters if people actually use it, including the people who are very good at telling themselves they're too busy. She sat down. For a moment, nobody knew what to do with that. Then Paolo Rennick, from somewhere near the middle, said loudly, "That was a terrible speech," and the room broke. Elliot Vance's collapse happened in public, over 11 days, in a sequence that Ashcroft City watched in real time. On the Thursday after the hearing, the U.S. Attorney's Office unsealed the second superseding indictment. 31 defendants, racketeering, conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, wire fraud, witness tampering, extortion, and in six counts that received the most attention locally, the deliberate obstruction of emergency medical services. Vance's name was on the caption as a cooperating defendant, which meant his exposure was reduced and his exposure was still catastrophic. On the Friday, his medical license was summarily suspended by the state board pending revocation. On the Monday, the Board of Trustees voted to seek recovery of $9.6 million in fraudulent payments and to refer 2 of its own members for prosecution, and the resulting resignations were announced in a 2-paragraph release that fooled nobody. On the Tuesday, Sylvia Okonkwo published the incident report timeline, all 22 side by side, with the closure justification printed in full each time so that readers could watch the same 3 words repeat down the length of the page like a heartbeat monitor going flat. It ran on the front page under the headline, "Insufficient Corroboration," and it won awards later, and Harper read it once and never again. On the Wednesday, Vance appeared for his change of plea hearing at the federal courthouse on Halstead. Harper did not attend. She was working a shift. She heard about it from Delphine, who had gone, and who described it later in the break room with a paper cup of coffee going cold in her hands. "He looked small," Delphine said. "That's the thing I wasn't ready for. I was always this tall man in those ties, walking around like the building was a shirt that fit him. And he stood up in there, and he was just a guy, in a suit that didn't fit anymore because he's lost about 20 pounds. Did he say anything?" "He read a statement. It was mostly legal." Delphine turned the cup. "But at the end he went off it. The judge let him. He said he'd taken the first payment because his wife had a health thing and the insurance had run out and it was $11,000, and he told himself it was one time. And then he said," she paused, getting the words right. "He said that after the first one, every single one after that was easy, and that's what he wanted people to understand. Not that it was hard, that it stopped being hard immediately." Harper leaned against the counter. "What did the judge say?" "Nothing. Just wrote it down." Deacon Ruel did not cooperate. Ruel went to trial 14 months later, was convicted on 19 of 22 counts, including the attempted murder of Tobin Marsh, which was on video from a body camera at the roll door, from an angle that captured everything, including Harper on one knee with her hands in the wound, and received a sentence that would put him in his 80s before he saw a parole board. At his sentencing, he asked to make a statement and used it to say, in a voice that carried across the courtroom, that he had done nothing that 100 people in that city weren't still doing. The judge said, "That may be true. It isn't mitigation." Harper went back on the floor 8 days after the hearing. There was no ceremony. She badged in at 6:52 p.m. with a new ID that had a better photograph, changed into her own scrubs, and went to the assignment board. And Delphine had put her in the trauma bay because Delphine was not a sentimental woman, and the trauma bay is where she was useful. The first patient of the night was a 14-year-old with a fishhook through the webbing of his left hand and a father who kept apologizing. The second was an 81-year-old woman in atrial fibrillation with a rate of 160, who told Harper, at length, about her late husband's opinions on the transit authority. The third was a man with chest pain who turned out to have a hiatal hernia and who was so relieved he cried. At 2:40 in the morning, in the quiet stretch, Harper was restocking the crash cart, the thing she had always done without being asked, when Mara Solano leaned in the doorway. "You know they offered me the CMO job." "I heard." "I said no." Solano rubbed her eyes. "I'd be terrible at it. I'd last 4 months and then I'd say something in a budget meeting and get walked out." "Probably." "Thanks." A pause. "Can I ask you something and you don't have to answer?" Harper kept counting ampules. "Go ahead." "Where'd you learn to do that? The thing in the basement?" Harper's hands didn't stop. "Before," she said. Solano waited about 4 seconds for more, didn't get it, and nodded. "Okay," she said, and left. The letter arrived at the end of the 3rd week. It came to the hospital, addressed to Harper by name, in a heavy envelope with a return address in a federal building in a city 800 miles east. Delphine put it in Harper's locker without comment. Harper opened it in her car at 4 in the morning with the dome light on. It was 2 paragraphs. The first was formal notification that the Classification Review Board had, at the request of the United States Special Operations Command, completed an expedited assessment of a service jacket bearing her name, and that a determination had been made regarding partial declassification of the record. The second paragraph advised that the determination required her consent, and that a representative would contact her within 14 days. Harper read it twice, folded it, and put it in the glove compartment. She drove home. She slept until noon. She got up and made eggs and did not think about it, and then thought about it, and then made herself stop. Because she knew what partial declassification meant, and it did not mean a medal. It meant that 11 years of a life she had deliberately buried, the names, the missions, the 406 people whose evacuations she had run, the 2 she hadn't, would become, in some limited and controlled form, a thing that existed in the world where other people could see it. It meant every reporter in Ashcroft City with Sylvie Okonkwo's phone number. It meant that Harper Brooks, the trauma nurse, who restocked the crash cart and got told to take a leave and walked into a basement with a fire extinguisher, would be permanently and publicly replaced by something else. She sat on the edge of her bed for a long time. Then she called the number on the letterhead and told the person who answered that her answer was no and thank you, and she'd like the file to stay exactly where it was. The person on the other end said that was understood and that a formal decline would be entered. Harper hung up feeling something she wasn't going to examine too closely and went to work. The representative came anyway. He came 11 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon, and he did not come to the hospital. He came to Harper's apartment on Decatur Street and knocked at 2:15 p.m., and when Harper opened the door on the chain, he held up credentials and said her full name, and then said, "Ma'am, my instructions are to speak with you in person about the decline." "I already gave my answer." "I understand that." "Then we're done." "Ma'am." Something in his tone stopped her from closing the door. "I'm not here about the medal." Harper didn't move. "There were 41 operations in that jacket," the man said. "The review board looked at all of them. 40 of them are exactly what the record says they are." The hallway was very quiet. "Which one?" Harper said. He held up a single sealed folder. "The one where you were listed as killed in action," he said, 11 years ago. "In a country the United States has never acknowledged operating in." He met her eyes. "The problem, Ms. Brooks, is that the man who filed that report is alive. He's currently in federal custody in Ashcroft City, and 40 minutes ago he told our people he wants to talk to you, and that if you don't come, he's going to start talking to everyone else instead." Harper took the chain off the door. She didn't invite him in. She stood in the doorway with one hand still on the frame and said, "Name." "Warrant Officer Dane Kilbride. I work for the review board." "Not your name, his." Kilbride hesitated for exactly as long as a man hesitates when he's been told to deliver information in a specific order and the person in front of him has decided to reorder it. "Sergeant First Class Aurelio Sandoval," he said. "Retired. Medically, 8 years ago." Harper stood very still. "Sandy's dead," she said. "No, ma'am." I watched him get loaded onto a Blackhawk with a sucking chest wound and a pressure in the 50s, and I got told 9 hours later that he didn't make Ramstein. You got told a lot of things that weren't true, Kilbride said. That's why I'm standing here. Harper let go of the doorframe. Come in, she said. Take your shoes off. The carpet's new. He sat at her kitchen table and she made coffee she didn't drink, and he laid out a version of 11 years ago that reorganized her entire memory of it while she stood at the counter with her arms folded. The operation had been an extraction. 4 operators pinned in a compound 80 kilometers past any line anybody would admit existed, with a 5th already down. Harper had gone in on the 2nd rotation as the combat medic because the 1st medic had been hit, and there was no 3rd. She'd been on the ground for 19 hours. She'd brought out 4 of the 5. The 5th, Sandoval, had gone out on a different bird with a different crew. The after-action report was filed by the ground force commander, Kilbride said, a major named Price Halloran. I know who filed it. Then you know it said the compound was cleared before you entered. It did not say that. It said that in the version that went up, Kilbride said. It didn't say it in the version you signed. Harper turned around. There were 2 reports, she said. There were 2 reports. Yours went into a drawer. His went into the system. His version has you entering a secured structure and providing routine care under minimal contact. Yours has 40 minutes of small arms and a medic doing surgical airways on a dirt floor while a building takes fire. Kilbride opened the folder. The difference matters because Halloran's version made the operation look like a success that didn't need review. Yours would have generated a full inquiry into why 5 men were in that compound with no exfil plan in the first place. Because he put them there. Because he put them there against guidance, yes. Harper sat down across from him. Her ribs, 3 weeks healed, complained about the angle, and she ignored them. So he made me a casualty, she said slowly. That's what the KIA listing is, not a mistake, a cleanup. That's the board's assessment. A medic who's dead doesn't contradict an after-action report. And by the time the paperwork would have caught up with the fact that you weren't dead, you'd been moved to a different element under a different designation, and Halloran had been promoted, and the file had been sealed for reasons that were legitimate on their face. He closed the folder. You never saw it because you never had cause to request your own jacket. Most people don't. And Sandoval? Sergeant Sandoval spent 4 months in Landstuhl and 11 surgeries. He was medically retired. He was also told, by Halloran's office, that the medic who went in after him had been killed on the exfil. Kilbride's jaw worked. He believed that for 11 years, ma'am. He named his daughter after you. Harper put her hand flat on the table. Don't do that, she said. Don't hand me that one on a plate. Just tell me the rest. Kilbride nodded once and told her the rest. And the rest was worse. Price Halloran had left the service 6 years ago at the rank of lieutenant colonel and gone into the private security consulting business, which in his case meant a firm that placed personnel and moved logistics for medium-sized commercial clients across 4 states. One of those clients was a medical staffing company with 3 employees and no clients of its own. He's the one who built the structure, Harper said. He's the one who built the structure. Ruel ran it. Halloran designed it. He's been in custody 11 days on a sealed warrant out of the same indictment, and until 40 minutes ago, nobody had connected his name to yours because your file was sealed and his was clean. What changed 40 minutes ago? Sandoval. Kilbride said it flatly. He's a witness in the case. He's been giving statements about Halloran's firm for 6 weeks. This morning our people showed him a witness list for the trial, and your name was on it, and he stood up in the middle of an interview room and asked why they were putting a dead woman on a witness list. Harper closed her eyes. And Halloran heard, she said. Halloran heard within an hour. He's got a lawyer and a phone, and he is not a stupid man. Kilbride leaned forward. He's now telling the U.S. attorney that he'll testify about the entire logistics network, every client, every route, 4 states, on the condition that his after-action reporting from 11 years ago is not entered into the record. And if that condition isn't met, he says he'll take his chances at trial and put everything he knows about a certain classified operation into an open courtroom, where it becomes public and where a lot of people who are still alive stop being safe. Harper opened her eyes. He's holding 400 people hostage, she said, so that one lie about me stays buried. Yes, ma'am. And what does the U.S. attorney say? The U.S. attorney says it's not her call because the sealed material isn't hers, it's yours. Kilbride slid the folder across the table. You declined declassification 11 days ago. That decline is what he's counting on. Nobody can unseal that file over your objection except you. Harper looked at the folder for a long moment. He needs me to keep protecting myself, she said. So he stays protected. That's the trap. Yes. She went to work that night because she was on the schedule, and because she had never in 11 years called out for a personal reason and did not intend to start over a folder on a table. It was a bad shift. A pediatric drowning at 9:40 that they worked for 50 minutes and lost. A homeless man with a foot that had gone septic all the way to the tarsals. A woman in her 30s who'd been assaulted by her partner and who kept saying she'd fallen and who took Harper's card and who Harper suspected would never call it. At 3:15 in the morning, Harper sat in the ambulance bay on an overturned milk crate and looked at the sky over the south corridor, which was the color of nothing, and thought about Kess. What does a man do when the only thing standing between him and consequence is somebody else's silence? He works very hard to keep them quiet. And what do you do? Harper had been 16 when he asked her that. She'd said something clever. He'd made her run the perimeter of the property 4 times and then asked again. She'd said, I make noise. He'd said, you make noise even when it costs you, especially then. The day it costs you nothing, it isn't worth anything. She'd thought at the time that it was one of his easier lessons. Harper stood up off the milk crate, went inside, washed her hands, and finished her shift. At 7:40 a.m., she called Kilbride and said, set it up. They met at the Federal Building on Halstead at 11 o'clock, in a room with no windows and a table bolted to the floor. Aurelio Sandoval was 51 and walked with a cane and had the specific ruined color of a man who has had 11 surgeries in a lot of years. He stood up when Harper came in and then didn't seem to know what to do with the standing. They said you were dead, he said. They said you were too. Yeah. His mouth pulled sideways. We were both bad at it. Harper crossed the room and hugged him, which she had not planned and which she immediately regretted because he made a sound against her shoulder that she was going to hear for a long time. They sat. Kilbride waited outside. Ines Barrow from the U.S. Attorney's Office sat at the end of the table with her hands folded and said nothing for 11 minutes. I named my kid after you, Sandoval said. I heard. That's a lot of pressure on a child. She's 10 and she throws a baseball like a howitzer. She's fine. He rubbed his knee, the cane hooked over the chair back. Harper, what do you need from me? Nothing. She meant it. You already did it. You stood up in an interview room and asked a question. That's not nothing? That's not nothing, Harper agreed, but it's also all you have to do. He looked at her hard. You're going to unseal it. Yes. You know what that costs you. I've got a fairly detailed estimate. They're going to put your face on every screen in this state, Sandoval said. They're going to dig through 11 years. They're going to find the 2 you didn't bring back, and they're going to ask you about them on camera. Some reporter's going to say their names out loud to your face and wait to see if you cry. Harper didn't answer right away. Yes, she said, and you're doing it anyway. He's using my privacy as a shield. She turned her hands over on the table, palms up, an old gesture she wasn't aware she still had. That's the part I can't live with. Not that he lied. Not even that he killed me on paper. That 11 years later the lie is still working. That it's out there doing him favors while I sleep. Sandoval was quiet. So I'm going to take it away from him, Harper said. That's all. It's not brave, Sandy. It's just the only move on the board. Ines Barrow spoke for the first time. For the record, she said, it's both. The consent to declassification was signed at 2:40 that afternoon, and it was 31 pages, and Harper read every one of them because she had learned what happens to people who don't. The board's determination was entered into the record on a Thursday. Price Halloran's leverage evaporated on the Friday. His attorney tried for about 6 days to reconstruct it. He argued that the material was still sensitive, that its entry prejudiced his client, that the timing suggested improper coordination. He was correct about the coordination, and it did not help him because by then the government had what it wanted, which was a case that no longer required Halloran's cooperation at all. Ines Barrow withdrew the plea offer on the following Monday. She did it in open court, in one sentence, and Harper, who was there this time, in the 4th row, in a gray sweater, because she had decided that some things you attend, watched Price Halloran's face while it happened. He looked at his lawyer first. then at the government's table, then, finally, at the gallery, scanning until he found her. He held her eyes for perhaps 4 seconds. He was 58 years old, with a good haircut and a suit that fit, and Harper had not seen him since a dust-colored airfield 11 years earlier, and what she felt looking at him was not hatred. It was a kind of flat, tired recognition, the way you recognize a room you were once trapped in and can now simply walk out of. She didn't nod. She didn't smile. She just looked back until he stopped. Halloran's trial ran 9 weeks the following spring, and it went badly for him from the second day. The government's case had 2 halves, and the halves fit together in a way that juries understand instinctively even when they can't articulate it. The first half was money. The staffing firm, the invoices, the routes, the 4 states, the $9.6 million out of Redwood Memorial alone, and another $22 million across 11 other institutions. Financial crimes are dull, and prosecutors know it, and Barrow moved through it briskly. The second half was what the money did. She put Isolde Mbeki on the stand and had her explain, in plain language, what a Pyxis lockout means at 9:04 p.m. during a mass casualty. She put Mara Solano on the stand and had her describe an intubation on a conscious man, and Solano got through it without crying and then cried in the hallway afterward, which the jury did not see and which the court reporter's transcript does not reflect. She put Delfina Duba on the stand for 2 hours and 40 minutes. She put Gail Ortega on the stand and walked her through 6 incident reports and 6 closures and a security escort to a parking lot after 12 years. She put Tobin Marsh on the stand in a wheelchair he would be out of within the year and had him describe being shot in the back by his own crew chief, and then had him identify the person who kept both hands on the wound for 9 minutes. And on the 4th week, she put Harper Brooks on the stand. Direct examination took 90 minutes. Cross took 4 hours and 11 minutes across 2 days, and Halloran's lawyer was good, and he came at her from every angle he had. He suggested she had exceeded her scope of practice in the intersection at Cordell and 8th. She agreed that she had, and explained why, and named the specific interventions, and said that she would do it again, and that the state board had reviewed it and issued no finding. He suggested she had used excessive force in sterile receiving. She said that 3 men had been injured, that 1 had a comminuted patellar fracture, and that she had chosen the knee specifically because it ends a fight without ending a person. He suggested, carefully, over about 40 minutes, that a woman with her training who chose to work as a nurse might have been looking for a situation like this. Harper let the question sit for a second. "No," she said. "I chose nursing because I got tired of being the last person a lot of men saw." The lawyer moved on. And on the second afternoon, he made the mistake that lawyers make when they've run out of road, which was to go at the 2 she hadn't brought back. "You've testified about a 19-hour operation, 4 survivors." "Yes." "There were 6 men in that compound." "There were." "So 2 died," Harper said. Specialist Rowan Ellery died at approximately 0340 from a wound to the left chest that I could not control. Corporal Nnamdi Ose died at approximately 0615 from injuries he sustained before I reached him. Her voice did not change. "I've said their names out loud maybe 6 times in 11 years. I'll say them as many more times as you want, counselor, but you should know that it doesn't do what you think it does." The room was extremely quiet. Halloran's lawyer said, "No further questions." The jury was out for 11 hours. They came back on a Thursday afternoon and convicted Price Halloran on all counts: racketeering, conspiracy, wire fraud, money laundering, obstruction of emergency medical services, and on a separate referral that had been running quietly alongside the whole time, 3 counts related to the falsification of official records. He was sentenced 11 weeks later to a term that his attorney described, accurately, as functionally a life sentence for a man his age. At the sentencing, the judge, a woman in her 60s named Perpetua Vance Okoro, no relation to anyone, who had presided over the entire 9 weeks with a face like a closed door, said something that ran in every outlet in the state the next morning. "Mr. Halloran," she said, "the financial crimes in this case are severe and they are not why I'm imposing this sentence. I'm imposing it because on a Wednesday night in this city, a 14-year-old boy with a fishhook in his hand and an 81-year-old woman in atrial fibrillation and 21 people pulled out of a bus were all in a building where the medicine cabinet had been deliberately locked so that you could make money. You didn't shoot anyone. You made it impossible for the people who were trying to help. There is a category of harm that operates through paperwork, and it kills just as effectively, and it is more contemptible because it requires no courage whatsoever. She paused. You were also an officer once who filed a false report to protect your career and let a 23-year-old medic be listed as killed rather than answer a question. I've thought about that a great deal. I've concluded that everything else you did was already contained in it. The Burnside crew's structure did not survive the spring. Deacon Rule was already in. 29 others followed across 4 states: the crew chiefs, the drivers, the pharmacy administrator, the facilities coordinator, the security supervisor, the 2 trustees, the police captain from the South Division, who took a plea in 8 years and whose fall did more to change Ashcroft PD's internal affairs process than any reform commission had in a decade. Diane Pruitt cooperated fully, got probation, and never worked in healthcare again. Elliot Vance was sentenced to 7 years, which was less than most people in Ashcroft City thought was right, and more than his attorney had argued for. He served it. Harper never saw him again and never sought to. When a reporter asked her 2 years later whether she'd forgiven him, she said, "That's not a question I have any authority over. He hurt about 400 people. I'm one. I can only speak for one." And the reporter printed it, and a lot of people found it unsatisfying, and Harper considered that a reasonable outcome for an unsatisfying situation. Redwood Memorial changed in ways that were slower and less cinematic than the trials. The 3-person incident panel became permanent, and then became a model that 11 other hospitals in the state copied, and then became a line in the state's licensing requirements. Every closed report had a name on it. In the first year, the panel received 194 reports, which was not because the hospital had gotten more dangerous, but because people had stopped assuming it was pointless. The controlled substance protocol was rewritten so that no single office could authorize a lockout during any period in which the emergency department was operating above a defined census. Isolde Mbeki wrote the first draft of it. She was 31 and had never written a policy in her life, and it took her 4 months, and it is still in use. Delphina Duba retired on schedule, 41 weeks after the night in sterile receiving, and at her party 160 people showed up, and she cried exactly once, at the very end, when the night float presented her with a framed photograph of an empty corridor. Gail Ortega took the reinstatement. She lasted 8 months and then left again, on her own terms, to teach at a nursing program in Fairlane, where she opens the second week of every semester with a lecture about incident reporting that students describe as intense. Paolo Rennick finished his residency and stayed at Redwood, and became in time exactly the kind of attending who is annoying in budget meetings. Mara Solano never took the CMO job. The recognition came anyway, because it always does eventually, and it came in 2 parts that Harper experienced very differently. The first was in October, at a facility 800 miles east, in a room with 200 people in dress uniform and a wall of names. The Special Operations Command entered a correction to the record of 11 years earlier, restored a service jacket to accuracy, and awarded a decoration that had been recommended and buried in the same week in a country nobody named out loud that afternoon. Harper stood at attention and let it happen and felt almost nothing, which surprised her, and which she thought about for months afterward. What she did feel was in the second row, where Aurelio Sandoval sat with his cane and his 10-year-old daughter, and where 3 other men she had last seen bleeding on a dirt floor, sat in a row beside him, all of them considerably older, and one of them missing most of his left hand, and all 4 of them stood up when her name was read and would not sit down. That was the part that got her, not the citation, 4 middle-aged men refusing to sit down. The second part came 3 weeks later and was much smaller. The Ashcroft City Council passed a resolution, a civic commendation, the kind of thing that gets a paragraph on page 11, recognizing a trauma nurse for actions during a mass casualty event. There was a plaque. There was a photograph in the paper. There was a reception in a municipal building with cheese cubes on toothpicks. Harper attended for 26 minutes. She gave a 2-sentence speech, which the council found abrupt, and which the 40 nurses who had shown up understood completely. "I want to say one thing, and then I want to go eat something," she said. "Nobody in this room does this job to be thanked, which is exactly why you should thank them anyway, because a person who doesn't need it will still remember it in about 15 years when it's 4 in the morning and they're deciding whether to keep doing this." Then she ate a cheese cube and went to work. Sylvia Okonkwo got the last interview, 18 months after everything, because she had asked 11 times and Harper eventually respected the persistence. They did it in the hospital cafeteria at 5 a.m. in the morning at the end of a shift, with a recorder on the table and 2 cups of coffee, and it ran to 6,000 words and won something. Most of it was about the reforms. But near the end, Okonkwo said, "Can I ask you the obvious one? You've earned it. What do you want people to take from this?" Harper turned the cup a quarter turn, an old habit. "Nothing dramatic," she said. "I get asked this, and people want the version where I say something about strength. That's not what it was." "So what was it?" "It was a phone call." Harper shrugged. "A gun fell out of a patient's waistband, and I picked up a phone and called security. That's the whole origin of everything you wrote about. It wasn't courage. It was a Tuesday, and I followed a rule that seemed obvious to me, and turned out not to be obvious to a lot of people who'd been standing in that building a lot longer than I had." "And that's the lesson?" "Part of it." Harper thought about how to say it. "Here's what I actually believe, and it took me 20 years and a lot of dead people to get to it. The dangerous thing isn't the guy with the gun. The dangerous thing is a room full of decent people who've all quietly agreed that saying something doesn't accomplish anything. That's how 22 reports get closed. Not because everybody's corrupt. One person was corrupt. The other 400 were just tired and reasonable, and they'd learned." Okonkwo waited. "I was one of them," Harper said. "I want that in there. I let something go in December because I had 11 patients. I've thought about that more than I've thought about the basement." "You stopped a robbery." "I did a thing I'd been trained to do since I was 14, in 19 seconds, and I'll be honest with you, it cost me almost nothing except 2 ribs." Delphina Duba walked into that room with no training at all and 22 people behind her who had families. "That's a different order of thing entirely, and I'd like the record to reflect it." Okonkwo turned a page. "Last one. You could have taken a different job after all this. A lot of doors opened. 11 of them. And you're still here at 5 in the morning." "Yeah." "Why?" Harper looked out the cafeteria window, where the sky over the south corridor was doing the gray thing it did before it committed to anything. "Because it's the only work I've ever done where the whole point is putting somebody back," she said. "I spent a long time on the other side of that ledger. I'm not going to pretend I've balanced it. But there's a 14-year-old with a fish hook in his hand at 2 in the morning who doesn't care what's in my file, and I go in there and I take it out and he goes home, and then the next one comes in." She set the cup down. "That's it. That's the whole thing. It's not a redemption arc. It's a job that needs doing every single night, and I'm good at it, and I intend to keep doing it until my hands go." She took one new thing. 3 months after the sentencing, the state health authority stood up an advisory board on healthcare worker safety, a real one, with subpoena support and a budget, not the kind that produces a report nobody reads. They asked Harper to chair it. She said no. They asked her to sit on it instead, as one voice among 9, with a specific mandate, the Working Group on Institutional Reporting Failure. She said yes, on 3 conditions: that she keep her clinical hours, that the working group's membership be at least half bedside staff and not administrators, and that every recommendation the board issued carry the names of the people who voted for it and the people who voted against. The 3rd condition caused an argument that lasted 6 weeks. She won it. 4 years later, the reporting framework that came out of that working group covers every licensed facility in the state, and there is a provision in it, Section 11, subsection C, requiring that any closure of a staff safety report be signed by a named individual who is personally accountable for the determination. It has no nickname. Nobody calls it anything. It's just a paragraph in a regulation that makes it slightly harder for a certain kind of man to be quiet. Harper thinks that's the best thing she's ever built. On a Wednesday in November, 4 years and 3 months after a gun fell on the floor of a trauma bay, Harper Brooks badged into Redwood Memorial at 6:52 p.m. She was 38. Her left side ached when the weather turned, which she'd been told to expect. Her hair had some gray in it now, at the temples, which she had decided to leave alone. She changed into her scrubs. She checked the board. She had bays 1 through 4 and a resident who was 6 weeks in and terrified. The first patient was a man in his 40s with a laceration to the forearm from a table saw, who kept apologizing for the mess. The second was a woman with a kidney stone who was, at 8:40 p.m., in more pain than anyone else in the building, and who by 9:15 was asleep and comfortable and holding Harper's hand for no reason either of them could have explained. The third was a child. At 11:20, the doors banged and a man came through carrying a 4-year-old girl who was blue around the mouth and not moving air, and he was screaming, and the resident froze for a full second and a half. Harper did not. She had the child out of his arms and on the table before the doors finished swinging, and she was talking the whole time in a voice that was low and completely level. Okay, she's got a partial, get me petty suction and a laryngoscope and page anesthesia. Sir, I need you to stand right there and not move. What's her name? And the father said, Rosalind, and Harper said, okay, Rosalind, we've got you. And 40 seconds later, a piece of a plastic bead came out of a 4-year-old's airway on the end of a pair of McGill forceps, and the room heard the loudest sound in the world, which is a child screaming. The father sat down on the floor. Harper crouched next to him with the kid in her arms, still screaming, red-faced and furious, and breathing, and put her free hand on his shoulder and said, she's fine. She's mad, which is better than fine. Take a breath with me. He took a breath. You did the right thing bringing her in, Harper said. Some people wait. You didn't. At 3:40 in the morning, in the quiet stretch, she restocked the crash cart. Nobody asked her to. Nobody watched her do it. There was no camera in that corner of Bay 2 and no record generated and no name on any form. And in the morning, the day shift would find the drawers full and think nothing of it at all, which was the entire point. Somewhere out in the city, there were people in cells because of what she'd done. Somewhere in a state office, there was a paragraph with a subsection number that existed because she'd argued for 6 weeks about signatures. Somewhere 800 miles east, there was a corrected file with her name spelled right on it, and 4 men who'd stood up and wouldn't sit down. None of that was in the room. What was in the room was a woman in her late 30s counting ampules under fluorescent light at 4 in the morning, with 2 ribs that ached when it rained and a 14-year-old memory of a cold garage, and a man who told her that making noise had to cost something or it wasn't worth anything. She'd paid it. She'd get up and pay it again if it came to that. But she hoped it wouldn't, because what she wanted, what she had always actually wanted, underneath every skill anyone had ever put into her hands, was exactly this: a stocked cart, a quiet bay, and the next set of doors banging open with somebody on the other side who needed help and didn't care in the slightest who she used to be. Here's the thing worth carrying out of all of it. Nobody is coming to tell you that you're allowed. There's no moment where the room turns around and grants you the standing to speak up about the thing you know is wrong. That moment isn't scheduled. What exists instead is a phone on a wall and a rule that seems obvious, and about 4 seconds where you either follow it or you decide you're too tired and it's not your department. Most people are not tested by a basement. Almost everyone is tested by the phone. And the people who change things are almost never the ones anybody was watching. They're the tired ones in the wrong-colored scrubs, the 63-year-old with the clipboard, the 31-year-old writing a policy draft she isn't qualified to write. They get underestimated their entire lives, and then one night the thing that was underneath the whole time simply stands up. And by the time the room understands what it's looking at, it's already too late to stop it. Be that, not loudly, not for the credit, just be